If you like, you may go to YouTube by just putting my name, Nasser Duwala. If you put my name in, you will see a host of videos come out. And most of them, of course, some of them are on international economics and some of them are on political economy. So just look at the videos that deal with political economy, and they're pretty much given titles. So you know exactly what each video pertains to. So for those of you who have missed any of the lectures, you can always go to YouTube by just putting my name in, Nasser Douala, on YouTube, and you will see all those videos come up for you. Okay, are there any questions before we start? Anyone has any questions? Okay, today what we want to do is we want to continue with the demographics of the MENA region. And as I have mentioned before, demographic is extremely important in the MENA region. It's such an important factor in economic development in the MENA region. So, you know, there's a lot written about demographics in the MENA region simply because of its importance. And basically demographics here has to do with population growth. So everything is pretty much focused on population growth and the challenges that the MENA region faces as a result of this rapid population growth. And we talked about that last time. We talked about what really leads to population growth. In other words, what's the causes of population growth? And we talked about the total fertility rate. We talked about things such as education, in other words, what really impacts total fertility rate. In other words, what changes total fertility rate. And we talked about many things, and we said that there's a combination of factors basically that impact the total fertility rate. There are economic factors, political factors, social factors. So it's basically a combination of all those factors, even though some demographers have argued that economic factors basically are really not well explained in terms of causing changes in total fertility rates, simply because they say that if you take income as an example, it could go either ways. It could increase fertility and it could also reduce fertility. So, you know, a lot of demographers have come up with studies, numbers, data that happens to conflict with one another. Now, a lot of other demographers have said that it's obviously more of social factors, especially culture and religion, that happen to have an impact on the total fertility rate. And others have said that, well, it's actually government policy through family planning that actually makes a difference to total fertility rate. So, you know, based on all of that, we know that the total fertility rate is extremely important for population growth, and that for countries to actually control population growth, they really have to start with that. And, you know, just to give you an example here, what happened in Iran, for example, before the Islamic Revolution in the 1978, and after the Islamic Revolution, a lot of things changed in as far as the total fertility rate is concerned in Iran. And all of that happens simply because of changes in attitudes and changes in the government decision-making process. So if we look at, and this is, by the way, given in your book as a case study, it's on page 135, and it says that the Iranian family planning has undergone two sharp reversals. In 1965, when the Shah instituted a family planning policy that, like most such programs at the time, stressed the supply side, in other words, the availability of contraceptions, and the program collapsed pretty much after the Islamic Revolution took over, simply because now the new regime that came under the Islamic Revolution, which is a theocracy basically, felt that this whole thing about family planning is pretty much associated with both the Shah, which obviously they're pretty much against, and the West, because they felt that the West had a lot to do with the Shah instituting family planning in the country. So they really didn't want to have anything to do with what the West wants to dictate to Iran, nor did they want to accept whatever the Shah was doing. They simply wanted to have a complete change, and that's basically why they called it a revolution. So the revolution then, since the new regime associated with both the Shah and the West, which they felt that the West actually helped finance the family planning program, it felt that they really need to put a stop to it. And however, the Ayatollah Khomeini, who was the leader of the revolution, felt otherwise. He, in fact, issued a fatwa. A fatwa here, of course, is a religious decree. That's what a fatwa is. And the Ayatollah Khomeini issued that fatwa permitting family planning and also permitting the use of contraceptions. So according to Ayatollah Khomeini, really something has to be done about population growth. And you know, you need to start somewhere, and obviously you have to start at the core, which is total fertility rate. And that's exactly what Ayatollah Khomeini did. However, things didn't go as smooth as Ayatollah Khomeini hoped for, simply because of social traditionalism and also the war with Iraq during the 1980s, which combined to produce pretty much a pro-natalist policy. And this obviously meant that now the Iranian government was establishing a new rule for marriage. In other words, they pretty much reduced the minimum age for marriage. And the High Council for Coordination of Family Planning was disbanded. So there is no more Family Planning Council here. Contraceptions became extremely hard to get. And the government provided large families with housing and food subsidies, which obviously encouraged large families. So you can see where things were going in Iran. Now, this policy obviously contributed to the reversal of the fertility decline that Iran saw during the Shah era. The total fertility rate rose from 6.5 in 1976 to 7 in 1986. And the rate of natural increase also, by the way, rose from 2.9 between 66 to 67 to 3.9 between 76 and 77, and still even further to 6.2 between during 1994. So, the population growth rate was really growing so rapidly as a result of this lax policies that were used by the new government. Now, what happened after that? Well, the census of 1986 that Iran took served as a wake-up call for planners, and also the end of the war with Iraq in 1988 provided them with their opportunity to start family planning all over again. So as a result, fertility began to fall, but only slightly, and it remained unacceptably high. The government completely reversed course, establishing again a population committee in the Ministry of Health. The committee, of course, had set a goal of reducing the total fertility rate to 4. For it was about 6. Now they wanted to reduce it to 4. Contraceptions were reintroduced. The healthcare system obviously was pretty much developed in order to make it easier for families to seek help, and which obviously covered Iran's vast rural areas as well as the cities. And all of these things were done, as I said, simply because they wanted to make sure to put a brake on total fertility. In other words, you see that in 1990, the government legalized female sterilization, and both male and female sterilization were offered without a charge. So all of these things happen to pretty much promote the limitations to total fertility rate. Seminars and the media also have been pretty much instrumental in promoting family planning. And in May of 1993, Parliament passed a law requiring the withdrawal of some subsidies from families that had a fourth or higher order child after May 1994. So basically what Iran was trying to do here was trying to replicate what China was doing basically with the one-child family. But they didn't reach that far, but they were pretty much in the process of getting there. And all of that, again, obviously has to do with the population explosion and the challenge that rapid population growth poses for economic development in the MENA region. So a lot of these countries found no cure for this except to take the hardcore initiative, which is simply make laws. In the case of Iran, of course, they issued fatwas, which is basically, religious decrees to actually, bring this under control, because you have to bring it under control if you expect to see any sort of progress along the lines of economic growth and development. That's the only way to do it. And in fact, Iran, showed some pretty good results out of all of that. In other words, the country's total fertility rate. Now, remember, what did we say the goal was? The goal was 4 total fertility rate, to reduce it to 4. But see, look at what happened here. The country's total fertility rate fell to 2.8 by 1996. And today it's between 2 and 2.1, which makes it below replacement levels. So in fact, this policy has done wonders for Iran. In other words, it was extremely successful. And, well, that's basically one important thing that I just wanted to share with you in as far as the effect of population growth and what it does to a lot of countries, especially less developed countries that actually need to put a stop to population growth. Now, you can have other countries, for example, or other leaders who actually feel exactly the opposite in terms of population growth. They look at population growth as their road to success and as their road to rapid economic growth. And this is this is another example here. You see another country, Algeria. Now, the leader of Algeria, of course, um, who was pretty much in favor of population growth, he actually delivered a speech in June 19 of 1969 that obviously, that speech was used as an inauguration, I guess, for uh, a large steelwork or steel plant at a city in Algeria called Annaba. He actually opened that huge steel plant with a speech. And listen to what he said in that speech, and I quote, this is what the president of Algeria was telling his people in that speech that he gave. He said that our goal over the next 20 years is to assure that our people, who will number 25 million souls, will have a standard of living which will be among the highest of the modern people of the world of tomorrow. I take this opportunity to say concerning what is called galloping demography. In other words, demographers who talk about huge population explosion, etc. This is what he had to say about this galloping demography, that we are not going to be partisans of false solutions, such as the limitations of births. In other words, we're not going to be taking any part in all these falsehoods regarding the limitation in the growth of population. They didn't want to have anything to do with it. So you can see that leaders in the MENA region do not have a consensus in as far as population growth is concerned. But I think these things are changing now. In the past 10 years, you find a lot of leaders in the MENA region who are obviously taking a very positive approach towards reducing population growth because they have recognized the dire consequences of having this relentless increase in job seekers, in labor markets that are pretty much weak and unable to provide the jobs or the quantity of jobs that this young, vibrant youths are seeking. And this has created a huge challenge, political, economic, and social. And up till today, leaders in the MENA region have not been able to resolve this issue. So if you look at the unemployment rates, as we will in just a few minutes, in the Arab world, they're staggering. And all of this is because of the demographic factors that we have just talked about. In other words, no solutions were presented to actually take care of these demographic factors in the MENA region. It really has cost these countries tremendously, especially those who happen to have huge population growth rates and who have very little resources. Now, for the other countries that have very small populations and they have huge resources, they really didn't have to worry about this. In other words, they had other things to worry about. Instead, these countries resorted to actually attracting foreign labor, migrant workers. Now, by doing that, that has also resulted in a lot of problems in those countries. And we will talk about the problems that migrant workers have brought to the mix. So, it has worked both ways. This population growth, or the lack of population growth, if you will, for certain countries, it has led to challenges, very similar challenges that pretty much affected the development trajectories of those countries. And we will obviously have a lot to talk about when it comes to that. So again, demography pretty much centers around population growth. This is something that hopefully by now we know. And we have already talked about the economic consequences of population growth. Can anyone just give me some of the economic consequences that population growth will cause or will bring forth? What are some of those that we talked about last time?
One of them was the need to provide more education for more children, whether it be through schools, having to create schools or buy supplies or pay teachers, that there's too many students to educate.
Very good. So that's one. What's the other one? There are a lot of problems that we talked about last time. Economic consequences of demographic change. What will rapid population growth result in?
So it would affect unemployment rates. Rapid population growth causes higher unemployment rates.
Very good. That's another problem. That's another problem, a very, very crucial problem too. And as far as population growth and its effect on the economy in terms of unemployment, it obviously increases unemployment, especially in the MENA region where labor markets are not pretty much structured and institutionalized. In other words, there is a lot of gap between the labor market in the MENA region and the educational institutions and other institutions that happen to produce skills. There is no coordination at all. So you can see that universities, colleges, and other technical schools, basically, they may be producing graduates that are not very much needed in the labor force. So in other words, the labor market is really not communicating with these institutions. And this lack of coordination obviously has affected the labor market tremendously. So you have a lot of people that come to the labor market without the proper skills that the labor market doesn't need. Now, this obviously will compound the unemployment problem. And this is something that policymakers have to do something about. In other words, make sure that the coordination between the labor market and the educational institutions is in place. Okay, what else? There are other things that population growth happen to affect the economy in many different ways. We talked about a few, but I'm still waiting to see what.
Lack of job creation, since private sectors are weak, the responsibility is then put for the government.
Yeah, that's another one. But what are the other ones that I believe are very, very crucial and extremely important? And you have them right there in front of you, basically, if you look at the notes that you have.
Low capital per worker.
Very good. Capital per worker, capital deepening, and job creation. That's a huge problem. Why is that? Why would population growth affect capital deepening? It can affect it in two ways. Can someone just tell me what are those two ways in which population growth will affect capital deepening?
If you have the same amount of capital spread over a larger population, then each person gets less and less each year.
Very good. So that's one. Well, what is the other one? The other one, probably some of you may not have thought about this, but I can tell you that the other crucial problem or challenge in as far as population growth when it comes to capital or capital per worker is that the government has to make a decision where to spend its money. It could either spend its money by investing in the capital stock, replenishing the capital stock, thus making capital more deeper, deepening capital, in other words, so that the capital labor ratio increases. Or it could spend that money for other purposes such as housing, roads, water, sewage systems. And that's exactly what happens when population growth is very high. In other words, the government here will have to make a choice. What do we do? So if they want to spend more on water, housing, electricity, sewage system, etc., they have very little left for capital deepening. So that's another problem. And it's usually something that happens in most of the less developed countries, especially in the MENA region, only in those countries that are resource poor, of course. The ones that are resource abundant, they do face challenges, yes, but the challenges that they face are not as acute as those countries or their counterparts who happen to have fewer resources. So these are basically some of the things that we talked about last time, and hopefully you will remember these things because it's going to help you for exam purposes.
Professor, I have a question.
Yes.
For growth purposes, is infrastructure building and the creation of the jobs more important, or is it the supplying of the capital and the tools with which to complete the jobs quicker? Which one is more important for GDP growth and the growth of a country?
Very good question. Now, the answer to that, of course, would be economic growth pretty much depends on capital deepening. Because what you want to do with economic growth is you want to expand the country's productive capacity to producing goods and services. So obviously, when you're spending money on housing, water, sewage systems, roads, etc., they may have an indirect effect, but their effect is not direct and it is not powerful. It's not as powerful as your spending on the absorptive capacity of the economy to producing goods and services. So that's basically where economic growth lies. So you want to make sure that most of your resources would go into the capital stock, replenishing the capital stock, would go to R&D, technological innovations, in order to increase the productivity of worker, and will go for human development purposes. Human development purposes here simply means more education for your labor force. So your labor force can become more skilled, your labor force will gain more knowledge, your labor force will be up to the task, and your labor force will be extremely productive. So those are the things that you need to do immediately, and make sure that you have enough resources set aside for these things. But then at the same time, I mean, countries, unfortunately, they have to worry about housing, water, sewage systems, roads. All of this social infrastructure is something that's important as well. But as far as economic growth is concerned, now you know what would really affect economic growth directly. Does this answer your question?
Yeah, it's a little bit of developing in human capital a bit more with the infrastructure building versus the physical capital with the physical capital building.
Right. I mean, yeah, it's very, in other words, the absorptive capacity of the economy is extremely important. And what I mean by that is the uh, production facilities of the economy in terms of factories, equipment, machineries, technology. All of that is extremely important, as well as, of course, labor, skilled labor. That's also important. You can't really have economic growth without skilled labor. Now, skilled labor is extremely important because that really what would determine the productivity of workers. And all of that is very, very important for economic growth and development. So yes, those are the things that governments would have to focus on more. That is not to say that governments would have to neglect investing in social overhead. Can't do that. You have to invest in social overhead. Otherwise, you're going to run into problems, and you're going to run into a lot of other challenges that will um, pretty much put a stumbling block towards economic growth and development. Does this make sense to you?
Yes, much more now.
Okay. So anyway, again, going back to population here, one of the things that we also have to focus on is the unemployment rate, because the labor market obviously is extremely important. You have to have um, a highly mobile labor market, highly flexible labor market, and a labor market that can in fact give the right, what should I say here, um, the right indicators, if you will, as to what the labor market needs most. So the labor market has to be equipped with all of these things. If that's the case, then I believe that countries will do a much better job if they have a labor market that happens to address and satisfy all of these requirements that I have just mentioned. But before dwelling into the labor market here, it's important to make a note of unemployment and the unemployment rate. Now, From macroeconomics, I'm sure all of you are familiar with what unemployment rate is and how the unemployment rate is measured. But usually, you know, when we talk about the unemployment rate, we're simply talking about the number of people unemployed divided by the labor force times 100. That will give you the unemployment rate. So you need to know the number of people who are unemployed. You divide that by the labor force and you multiply it by 100 and you get your unemployment rate. Now, this is a lot easier said than done. In reality, of course, it's extremely difficult to come up with this unemployment rate, even in advanced countries, by the way, like the US. I mean, who knows what the unemployment rate is? It's just an estimate that the Labor Department gives us once a month, comes up with these numbers. But how accurate they are, nobody really knows. Because again, it's based on estimates, it's based on what the Labor Department gets from the surveys that it conducts and from the sample that it uses, the statistical sample that is used. So, you know, there are a lot of ifs about the unemployment rate, even in developed countries. So these are just estimates. And then, of course, you know, the definition of unemployment also is extremely important. How do you define unemployment? How do you define someone is unemployed? How do you know if that person is unemployed or not? So there are certain categories that are used to define those people who are unemployed. So according to the US and the Western world, of course, they pretty much have the same definitions or criterias, if you will, for determining who is unemployed. And for the US, the person who is unemployed is anyone who happens, first of all, to be looking for a job and cannot find one. And not only that, there is also another criteria used, and that is if a person happens to be working, let's say, for a few hours a week, let's say even 3 hours a week, that person is considered employed and not unemployed. So now you can see the problems that we can find by looking at that unemployment rate. Because a lot of those people who would like to get a full job, basically, are not included in the unemployment rate. They're simply considered to be employed, even if you are working just 2 or 3 hours a week. And also, you know, the unemployment rate does not include those workers who become discouraged and as a result have stopped looking for work. So in order for you to be unemployed, you must be someone who is actively and continuously looking for work. If you skip 2 or 3 weeks and you don't look for work, or you have not been looking for work, then obviously you are immediately struck out from that number that the Labor Department uses to measure unemployment. So there are a lot of flaws in the way that we measure the unemployment rate. Now, this is in the advanced countries. Now, let's see what's happening in the less developed countries, especially in the MENA region. Now, how do we know what the unemployment rate is? Now, of course, you know, the World Bank and the IMF, they pretty much, you know, they spent a lot of money and they put a lot of people to work trying to, you know, determine the unemployment rate in less developed countries and in the MENA region. So if you look at the unemployment rates in most countries in the MENA region, these unemployment rates are pretty much determined and published by world organizations such as the World Bank. In other words, probably the governments and local institutions have no idea of what the unemployment rate is, nor have they made any effort to actually try and find what the unemployment rate is in their countries. Well, of course, there are some exceptions here and there, but on the whole, generally, I mean, you know, these countries happen to be basically relying on international organizations to do the work for them. And this is a huge mistake again. Why don't the MENA region have government departments in the labor department, for example, or in the planning department, or whatever the case may be, to actually find ways to determine what the unemployment rate is in their countries? I don't know. That's still a question that I have, and unfortunately, I have no answers to. But that's what you have. Now, again, in the less developed countries, the whole thing is based on surveys. Now, in the US and in European countries, it's a lot easier to undertake the surveys or to conduct the surveys. In the MENA region, it's extremely, extremely difficult to conduct surveys because really nobody cares. Let's put it this way. And nobody is interested. So now what do you do? How do we know what the unemployment rates are in the MENA region? Now, of course, if you look at a lot of publications, especially this book that you have in front of you, I mean, you know, it does have tables, you know, relegated to the unemployment rates. And sometimes, you know, I laugh at these numbers because deep down I know that these numbers are not very accurate. And basically, there is really no transparency. I mean, you know, when you look at these numbers, how did they come up with these numbers? What kind of statistical samples did they use? And nobody knows. So, you know, again, we have to be very careful when we look at these numbers, and we have to interpret them with a lot of caution. In other words, it's not something that we can take for granted. So that's basically how the unemployment rate is measured. It's simply the number of unemployed divided by the labor force times 100. Now, how about the labor force participation rate? How do we measure the labor force participation rate? Again, in Western countries, industrialized countries, there are certain criteria, certain ways, certain agencies who are actually responsible for determining the labor force participation rate for both male and female, and then again for the entire population. But first, how is the labor force participation rate defined? Anyone? How do we define the labor force participation rate? From your principles of macro, I'm sure most of you have seen that already, but anyone remembers? How do we measure the labor force participation rate?
You get the employed and unemployed, and then you divide it by the population.
What do you do?
You add up the employed and unemployed and divide it by the population.
Yeah, so far, so good, except one thing.
Oh, and then multiply by 100.
No, not that.
Oh.
You're absolutely right when you say unemployed plus employed, which is obviously the labor force, right?
Uh-huh.
That's how we define the labor force. The labor force is equal to the employed plus unemployed. And you're correct in saying employed plus unemployed. So you're talking about labor force. Dividing it by, you said population. Now what you need to divide it by is not population, but the working age population. okay, from 16 to 65.
Okay,
That's
got it.
considered to be the working age population. So you cannot divide it by the whole population, but only by the working age population. So again, the labor force participation rate is defined as labor force divided by working age population times 100. That will give you the labor force participation rate. And again, you know, the same thing, of course, the way it is measured in less developed countries in the MENA region, the same way as I have just defined it here. But again, the numbers that we get usually are not very accurate. They are obviously a lot more accurate in the advanced countries than you would get in the less developed or the MENA region, simply because the data is not available. A lot of the data that we want is pretty much not available. So what these international organizations end up doing, like the World Bank or the IMF, they will extrapolate some of the missing data based on certain forecasts. So what you're doing here is you're forecasting what you need to forecast, basically. And this, you know, makes the whole problem even worse when it comes to numbers in the MENA region. So, you know, there are a lot of measurement problems in as far as you know, trying to collect data for the MENA region, and this is a huge problem. And as I said before, I don't know why that these governments with so many resources, especially the resource-rich region, they have not been able to come up with solutions to these problems. These problems are extremely important to address and come up with solutions to, because you really can't design and formulate policies, economic policies, developmental policies, without actually knowing what these datas are and how you're going to collect them and how you're going to measure them, because it really helps policymakers come up with the right and the necessary policies to actually put in economic plans. And when those data are not available, this really makes the job of a policymaker extremely hard. So if we look at, for example, just some of the unemployment rates in the MENA region, and I guess, you know, the book really here gives you on page 144, you know, tells you female and male unemployment rates. So you can see that in 2010, the unemployment rate in the MENA region as a whole was about 17.6% for female and 7.8% for male. This were the unemployment rates in 2010. And you also have female and male labor force participation rates. And these are obviously given by countries. So you really have to go through each country separately in order to be able to determine what the labor force participation rates are. But just to take an example here, if you look at the total labor force participation rate in Algeria, in 1990, it was 41.9%. In 2010, it was 43.9. So again, the labor force participation rate is very low. Now, compared with developed countries, the labor force participation rate is usually around 70%. Here in Algeria, it's about 43%. In Bahrain, it's pretty good. It went up from 64 to 70%, which is pretty good. In Egypt, very low, 50% in 1990. It went down to 48% in 2010. Very low. Iran, the same thing, 44% in 1990, 44.7. And 2010, 44.3. So you can see that a lot of these countries are in the 40s. Iraq, the same thing. And the labor force participation rate is 41%. Jordan, 41%. Kuwait, 67. Lebanon, 45. Libya, 53. Morocco, 49. Oman, 60. Palestine, 40. Qatar, that's very high, 86%, which is pretty good. But then again, you know, the population of Qatar is so small, so I wouldn't be surprised to see such a high labor force participation rate. And then basically, most of the people that are actually working in Qatar, they're migrant workers. So migrant workers, before they go to Qatar, they are guaranteed to have a job. Otherwise, they won't be able to enter the country. So from that point of view, I mean, you know, for Qatar to have such a high labor force participation rate is understandable. But look at Saudi Arabia, 50%. Sudan, 53. Syria, 42. Tunisia, 47. Turkey, 49. United Arab Emirates, again, very high, 79.1. And again, because population is very small and they rely pretty much on migrant workers. How about, let's see now, Oman. I want to see Oman because that's also another country that
It's at 60.
60 that happens to depend on, yeah, which makes sense. So those are, you know, some of the things that obviously play a huge role in the development trajectory. So, you know, when you see countries with very, very low labor force participation rate, that simply means that there is a huge weakness in labor markets. And I don't know, again, I mean, these numbers are available to MENA regions. When they see that they're facing such a problem in their labor markets, why aren't they doing anything about it? This is another mind-boggling thing that really, you know, I really have to struggle with. And I say, well, look, here's the problem, very clear, got to do something about it. Why is not anything done about this? So you can see where I'm taking you with this, and as far as the MENA region is concerned. And, you know, some of the problems that we talked about, why the MENA region is underperforming. So a lot of the thing has to do with planning. No planning whatsoever. No urgency. I mean, time is not that important. I don't know why, but that's how they look at time, as something not that important. Okay, they look at a problem and they say, okay, we need solutions to it, but you know, we can take our sweet time. It's like I give you a very good example right now in Libya, what's happening in Libya. I don't know if a lot of you are following what's happening in Libya, but you see all of these demonstrations by youths, you know, between the age of 16 and 28, take to the streets, demonstrating. What are they demonstrating for? Number one, for jobs. But now you have more people coming out demonstrating. For what? electricity, water, liquidity. Banks are not functioning in Libya. In other words, you cannot have more than 400 dinars a month. That's all you can withdraw from your bank account. I don't care how much money you have in your bank. The maximum you can withdraw is 400 dinars. Now, what is 400 dinars? There are 3 exchange rates in Libya. That makes things even worse. Not 1, but 3. So you have 1, the official exchange rate, which is 1.6 dinar to a dollar. That's the official exchange rate. And good luck for getting that exchange rate. You can't unless you're pretty much connected to government officials. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to get that official rate. 1.6 dinar for $1. The other rate is about 3.9 dinars to a dollar. And this is an exchange rate that the government has approved of. Why? Because it has added close to 3 dinars or 2.5 dinars to the official rate as tax. So they said, okay, if you really want to have foreign exchange, if you want to have dollars, well, you got to pay a tax. We're going to charge you 160, which is the official exchange rate, plus 2.3 dinars. So that will, bring the exchange rate to about 3.9. Again,
So
good
there's
luck.
100% tariff on everything coming in?
No. This is just for the currency here to exchange your money to dollars. Okay? It's not a tariff on goods imported from overseas, no. There are certain tariffs, of course, but they're not 100%. But I'm talking about a tax on currency, foreign currency.
I was thinking like an effective tariff, but I can see how it's not necessarily the same mechanism.
No, it's not, no. So this is the other exchange rate. So you have one exchange rate, which is equivalent to 1.6 dinars for $1. The other one is 3.9 dinars for $1. The other one, which is the black market rate, that's 6 dinars. Now you can get that very easily, and you can get as much as you want through the black market. Even if you have 1 million dinars and you want to convert them to dollars, that's fine. And everything is done in cash, by the way, in the black market. No checks, everything in cash. So if you have 1 million dinars, you better bring a lot of bags with you and also bring a lot of armed guards with you. So you see the situation here, what's going on? I mean, it's a hopeless country, basically. No rules, no laws. And then there is no electricity. Now, how come, people are not having electric power? Why? No water. And because of the squeeze on the exchange rate, as well as on the money that you can withdraw from the bank, what do you think is going to happen to spending?
Well, people, like if you especially cannot take out like a loan or anything, or you can't depend on the bank, then they'll just put all of their, like they'll just hoard all their money and then not spend and wait.
Right, yeah. Well, a lot of people obviously have pretty much depleted their savings by now. And there's simply, no money to go around, no liquidity, no cash, basically. So people have taken out to the streets and they have said, what's going on? Where is the government? Where are the policy makers? Where are the decision makers? Why aren't these problems solved? And the government, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just wondering, like, we have a Fed and then we have like the government that work together when it comes to like economics and in terms of like what loan rates are and things like that. Do these countries have a divided system similar in that they have like an entity and then the government?
Sure, very, very similar. Libya has a central bank. Now, Libya sells a lot of oil. Every day they sell probably close to, maybe right now, obviously it has gone down, but right now they probably sell about 1.5 million barrels a day in oil. Now, all of that money goes to the central bank.
Mm-hmm.
So now let's say, the central bank gets about maybe close to $12 billion a year in oil revenues. That's the least, the minimum, $12 billion. Also, Libya has a lot of investments overseas. They have bought a lot of assets during the Gaddafi regime. So they have close to about maybe close to $250 billion worth of foreign investments. And this is the minimum, again, could be more, but 250 billion.
Mm-hmm.
And they have close to about 140 tons of gold in reserve. And they have close to about, I would say, $60 billion in reserves with the Central Bank of Libya. Now, all of this, the Central Bank of Libya happens to control. But the Central Bank of Libya is saying, hey, wait a minute. I can't be giving money out. I mean, we need this money. We need to keep them for future generations. And we will only give the government a certain amount every year to take care of its federal budget or the general budget. And that's all we can do. We can't give any more. Now, what is happening here? When the government gets its budget from the central bank, instead of using that money to take care of, let's say, power grids, electric grids, take care of producing water, etc., a lot of it goes in corruption. This is a huge problem in Libya.
It's really interesting.
Yeah, most of it goes in corruption. Government officials, all of them, from the bottom to the top, to the prime minister. No one is excluded from corruption. They are all corrupt, them and their family. Now you take the prime minister, for example, of Libya right now, by the name of Faiz al-Sarraj. Now this guy, his family does not live in Libya. His family lives in London. And guess what? They have a luxurious house that costs about $10 million. Now, where did you get this $10 million? You didn't have that $10 million before you became a prime minister. So where did that money come from? Is your salary, you've been in office now for 5 years, is your salary $2 million a year? So, and people are questioning these things. People know. So it's not like something that nobody knows anything about. There is a lot of corruption going on. And it seems like the reason why they're still in power is because they're looking to actually support one another for the simple reason, because if one falls, everyone else is going to fall. And in order for them not to fall and not to subject themselves to a lot of interrogations and investigation in as far as where did they get this wealth from that they and their kids have. And all of them, by the way, they have their kids studying abroad, their kids, their wives living abroad, and no one is living inside. So they don't have to worry about electricity shortage. They don't have to worry about water shortage. They don't have to worry about, feeding a family on 300 dinars a month. All of these things to them, it's, It has, never came across to them. All what they were busy doing is simply how to steal. And this is the best word I can find for it. This is the time used. Time used is finding ways to steal, finding ways to change the books. And this is not to say that the chairman of the central bank is immune from corruption. Absolutely not. He's found to be extremely corrupt too, him and his family. So again, going back to corruption, this is the key. If you want to have a development trajectory in the MENA region or anywhere else in the world, that development trajectory must be based on transparency, full transparency, and lack of corruption. Because once you start having corruption in one area, it will simply feed on to other areas. And anything that you will do will simply not see the light of day. So we really have to find ways how to control and eliminate corruption as much as possible. If we don't do that, then we can't hope to proceed. Yes?
I was going to ask, is the banking system corrupt? Or, because like, I mean, having a limited amount of money that they're giving to the government seems like a pretty like good start.
Sure, sure.
Or do they have like their own like corruptions?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, what the Central Bank of Libya is doing, and you can't fault them for that, is saying, hey, we can't give you more than what your budget dictates. You say that you're going to spend $60 billion a year, let's say, and you have given me exactly on what you want to spend it. Here it is. This is a check for 60 billion. Now don't come back to me and say you need more, because I'm not going to give you any more. I'm going to give you exactly on what your budget is dictating. And in your budget, you're saying you're going to put 10% for electricity, you're going to put 30% for salaries, you're going to put 10% for water, you're going to put 15% for development. In other words, your budget says all of that. That's how you come up with that number. You take it to the central bank, the government takes it to the central bank and says, hey, this is my budget. I want you to fund this budget. And the central bank will say, okay, we'll fund the budget, no problem. Let me look at it. Let me give it to my experts here to look at it and find out that everything is okay. Because remember, the government cannot ask for the full amount from the central bank. The central bank is not going to give the full amount. The central bank will give part. Now, where will the other part come from? It will come from taxes. The government is taxing people, right? So part of it has to come from taxes. Employees are being taxed as well. The government levies duties on imported goods coming from overseas. The government owns a lot of companies, like, for example, the telephone companies. In other words, all of these things that you need in order to be able to call people outside or to have the internet, or all of that is controlled by the government, and they obviously levy huge fees on all of those. So the government does have revenues of its own, and the government has to come up with the amount of revenues that they're getting, and then the difference will be given by the central bank. Is this understood how things work?
Yeah, it's really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. So that's basically what we have. And unfortunately, again, we go back to corruption and a lot of other things that we talked about. It's not just corruption, but so many things. So you can see that the MENA region is pretty much overwhelmed with so many challenges. And the problem right now for the MENA region is that really they have not been very serious in trying to tackle these challenges. in trying to organize their resources, their time, to make sure to set priorities, to make sure to have the right people in the right place, to make sure that there is transparency. So there are a lot of things that these governments need to put in place. And unfortunately, none of this exists in the MENA region, or very, very few in certain countries. I'm not gonna, pretty much generalize this on all countries. That would be not a correct thing to do. But these are some important problems, important issues that need to be resolved, basically. Okay, so again, if you look at the unemployment rates in the MENA region, you see that the unemployment rates are pretty high for most countries, in fact. And again, by the way, going back to the statistics and going back to the measurements, can someone tell me, how do we measure the total fertility rate? How do we know that the total fertility rate in 1990, let's say, for example, is 5? Based on what?
The amount of reported births.
For a particular year, based on what? In other words, when you say that the total fertility rate of women in the MENA region, let's say, is equal to 5. So that means on the average, each woman during her lifetime is going to bear 5 children. But now you're putting this number in 1990, right? But the woman does not bear those 5 children in 1 year. Correct? Does everyone follow here? So what type of measurement criterions are we using here? I don't know, to tell you the truth, because I tried to look at all of these things and I don't see no transparency whatsoever on how they came up with these numbers. Averages based on what?
That is a pretty interesting point to make. Yeah, how do you really determine how many kids a woman's going to have over her whole lifetime until she's a lot older? You can't really make that judgment call.
Absolutely, that's what I'm trying to say. So, and unfortunately, nobody is really bringing up these issues. Everyone is taking all these things for granted. But when I look at these numbers, I pretty much try to delve into these numbers and find out how do they come up with some, certain things like that. I don't know. I mean, I tried to do my own research, but usually, I don't find adequate explanations or reasonable explanations.
Maybe family size? I don't know.
I don't know. I wish they can tell us.
Average familial unit, if it's like 5, if it's like a group of 4 for, I think the standard US is 4, but over there if it's like a group of 6 with 4 kids or a group of 7 with 5 kids, I don't really know.
We don't know.
Maybe a way.
Yeah, I don't know either. That's why I just wish that these people who actually compile this data tell us exactly how they came up with that. And I don't know. Maybe, for advanced countries, if I look into it, they probably have ways of doing it. But I'm saying for the MENA region, excuse me, how are they doing it? Nobody knows. Anyway, I think we're running close to the end of our session here, or probably over it, 1 minute over. But again, I just like to remind you that if you like to access this lecture or this recording, make sure you do it on YouTube, because I'm having a hard problem trying to get it from Zoom, basically. They do send me the link, but sometimes the link doesn't work. And this is a problem, and that's why I decided to go ahead and do it through Zoom. And the way I'm doing it through Zoom is I'm taking it from my Dropbox, basically. That's the only way to do it, simply because the Zoom link really doesn't work. So I'm recording it through my Dropbox, and from my Dropbox later on, I put it on YouTube. Now, if I try to do this directly on YouTube as I'm lecturing, it's gonna have some difficulties as well, simply because we can't have answers and questions while I am recording on YouTube. That creates a lot of problems. Plus, when you are on Zoom and YouTube simultaneously, that also creates problems. So, the best thing I said would be to have it recorded on my, saved in my Dropbox, and then from my Dropbox, I take it and I pretty much put it on YouTube. So just, put my name, Nasser Duello, on YouTube, and you will get a lot of these lectures available to you. And please let me know if you're having any problems. Okay?
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Professor. I've already found your YouTube channel. Looking forward to it.
Okay, no problem. Any other questions? Okay.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. So I guess we don't have any more questions. So I wish you all a good weekend, and hopefully to see you on Tuesday. And we will continue again with this unemployment thing and population growth for probably another session or two, because we still have a lot to cover. And after that, we will probably have a session that we will go over the midterm exam. And hopefully we should be able to have the midterm exam somewhere around the 20th, somewhere around there.
Thank you, Professor.
Have a good weekend, Professor.
You too. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.